Okay, my name is Tim Wachtmann, and I'm from Plantscapes of New England, which does work on ecological restoration. And we also help people with designing, installing, maintaining native landscapes and selecting and sourcing plants for native landscapes. And this is the Plantscapes website located at plantscapesne.com. And I'll just point out, if you scroll down to the bottom of the homepage, there's some links to tips that I've prepared for Plantscapes clients, but a lot of the information that you'll be hearing about tonight is located on the website. And also right next to the tips, there's a link to the notes for the presentation tonight that you'll be able to access for several days after tonight's talk. So you can download those and you don't have to worry about writing down book titles or websites or anything that I'll mention tonight. Also on the homepage, there's a link to Plantscapes events. So keep an eye out for future presentations. I take the summer off and focus on other things, but I plan on being back with some new talks in the fall and through the winter. Okay, and the first installment in this series, Why Native Plants, I talked about the main motivation for including native plants in our landscapes, which is to support and enhance biodiversity. And I also contrasted the two mindsets that are out there for thinking about landscapes. There's the traditional suburban ideal shown in the upper left-hand corner here, which from an ecological standpoint is not very valuable. And even aesthetically, it's, to me, not particularly interesting either. The landscape shown here is one that has high ecological value and a great deal of interest as well throughout the 4 seasons. So transitioning from a traditional view of landscapes to a more ecological approach has a lot of environmental benefits, but also there's aspects to think about in terms of lower inputs, lower pollution, and less work involved in maintaining a native landscape. In the second talk, Planting for Native Pollinators, I talked about pollinators being a big component of the biodiversity crisis and the important role that pollinators play in our food production, how they are essential to biodiversity in general, from providing food for birds, as well as many other organisms that are in the environment. And also how inviting pollinators into your landscape has a lot of aesthetic appeal in itself. The butterflies and bees provide a whole other level of dynamic interest in the landscape. So tonight I'm going to present a number of suggestions on ways that once you have decided to include native plants in your landscape, or if you have native plants already, ways that you can enjoy and engage with that landscape. And one of the first things that I suggest is writing down a plan for your landscape. This is kind of a first step to in engaging with your environment that allows you to plan for the future, but it also gives you a way to work efficiently as you're transitioning from a traditional landscape to a more ecological one. And there are a lot of programs and things out there that can make really elaborate landscape designs, but for most people, all you really need to do is make a simple sketch. It helps if it's to scale, so maybe do it on graph paper, but that's not even absolutely necessary. Once you get a sketch in place, you can start developing a plant list based on things that you've read, presentations like this, visits to native nurseries and native gardens around the area. And as you're developing that plant list, I encourage you to consider things that we've been talking about, like including keystone species and specialist host plants that will support the greatest amount of biodiversity. So once you have a plan in place, I'd say don't be too rigid about it. Be willing to be flexible. So you don't always have to adhere to golden rectangles or someone's 9 rules for native landscape design. Whatever, there's lots of different ways to approach a native landscape. So feel free to make that approach your own. Also, people often have plants in their landscape that they are very attached to, and some of those may not be native plants. And I think it's important to say that if you have plants like that, feel free to keep your favorites. If you have an umbrella pine or English roses, something that you're really attached to, there's no reason to rip those things out and replace everything that you've become attached to with native plants. So it's not an all or none proposition at all. Also, you want to work at your own pace. A rather intensive installation plan might extend over 3 to 5 years very easily. So be patient and realistic about how much you can bite off as you're transitioning your landscape. And keep in mind that there's going to be an establishment period for a lot of these plants where they need some extra watering and care for a season or two. So you want to make sure you don't put so many things in at one time that you're not able to care for them during that establishment period. Also keep in mind that landscapes change over time. Trees will grow and shrubs will spread. Therefore, the light conditions and moisture and soil conditions will change over time. So it's one of the things about native landscapes is giving up the idea of having tight control about everything that's going on. We often need to learn to let nature take its course and be more curators of that environment rather than controllers of every last thing that's going on. And finally, keep your eye out for natural contributions. As you're working with your landscape, hopefully removing invasive species and such, that creates space for plants in the surrounding natural environment to come into your landscape. So you may see various things popping up from time to time. And if you try and identify those and find a place for them, they can often be nice additions to the landscape. I had some pokeweed that was probably deposited by some birds. So it just popped up in my along my vegetable garden one season. And that's turned out to be a nice little addition that was a complete surprise. But those sort of things happen all the time if you're open to them. In the last talk, I introduced some of these guys as well as some other native pollinators. And as you plant more and more native plants in your environment, you're going to invite a lot of different types of wildlife in. And one of the ways to enjoy and engage with your landscape is to learn their names and habits. So really make them your new friends in the environment. Figure out what they need for nesting and feeding, who their friends and enemies are. There's a lot of interesting things that you can learn and watch out for in terms of their life cycles and behaviors. And as you gain new friends in your environment, you may want to research again who they are and what their lifestyles are. There's a lot of field guides and things out there to help you figure these things out. One of my favorite series is from Don Stokes, who I think is the preeminent New England naturalist. He covers the whole gamut from insects to birds to wildflowers, shrubs, native trees. And he does it in a very interesting way, I think. It's really a romantic approach to nature, where he's encouraging people to explore and discover things about their landscape by making direct observations. And he helps to do this by teaching us techniques for observations. So rather than bird watching, his bird series is based on bird behaviors. So for each of the species of birds that he talks about, he gives a whole series of things for the backyard naturalist to keep an eye on, and teaches us how to make those observations. And this is something I think we often are at risk of losing, because we're so screen dominated now that we really have to make an effort to get outside and make those observations and connections. So if there are things that you're trying to identify, either plant or animal in your landscape, the nature guides and field guides are a good way to do that, but it requires some effort to track those resources down and look through them. A very powerful tool for doing this as an app is iNaturalist. And this is actually a citizen science program, which I'll talk more about citizen science in a bit. But it's a crowdsourcing way of identifying wildlife, either plant or animal, in your environment. There's close to 4 million users of iNaturalist now. And when you snap a picture of a wildflower or an insect and upload that to iNaturalist, there'll be a lot of local naturalists that will give suggestions on what that plant or animal might be. And then you can take it from there and do more research and learn more about that observation. Importantly, iNaturalist is also a citizen science program. So all the data and observations, pictures that are uploaded to that site become a useful repository of information for scientists and others who can make use of that data as well. Okay, one other way that many people like to enjoy their native landscape is by planting edible native plants and then foraging in their backyard. And in this slide, I pulled out a small selection of all of the possible native edibles that are out there. In the upper left, this is New Jersey tea, which has an interesting story. When the American colonists were boycotting English tea, they were able to use this plant as a substitute. And if you combine the leaves of New Jersey tea with wild bergamot, you can get pretty close to a good blend of Earl Grey. And another type of edible plant that you can put in your environment is ostrich fern. This is one of the largest and most dramatic of our native ferns, but the fiddlehead heads are also a real delicacy. So those can be collected and eaten early in the season. There are a whole host of edible berries and fruits, from the black chokeberry, which is kind of a misnomer. It's not at all unpalatable. Our wild grape, the fox grape, which you'll often find growing over trees or walls. Pawpaw has become very popular lately. This does require a bit of space, and it tends to spread by suckering. So it will produce a colony of plants, but the fruit from the pawpaw is very interesting. And also things like blackberries and raspberries in the brambles family are very easy to grow. And then we have things, one of my favorite edible natives is the American hazelnut. It's a very attractive plant. Even the seeds, when they're on the nuts, when they're on the plant, have an interesting characteristic. And the American hazelnut has wonderful fall foliage as well. So it makes for a very dramatic hedge, a very nice substitute for the invasive burning bush, for example. One guide to native plants in general, but edible natives in particular, is Native Plants for New England Gardens by Mark Richardson, who is at the Native Plant Trust and is now at Tower Hill Botanical Garden, and Dan Jaffe, who is also at Native Plant Trust. And Dan in particular is a real enthusiast for edible native plants. And I've included a link to his website, and I encourage you to take a look at that. He's promised to add more and more recipes over time for things that you can do with native plants. So Dan's a great resource for edible natives, and he often does very interesting talks as well throughout this region. A couple things I'll say about edible natives: be prepared that you'll have to compete with wildlife for them. So birds and squirrels in particular will try to beat you to the fruits and nuts, and they often do, because they will pick them before we think they're quite ready. But you can either share with them, or you can do things with fencing and nets to exclude them if you want to get more of the produce. Another thing to keep in mind, this is our native elderberry. It's important as you're thinking about harvesting the native edibles and eating them, that you do appropriate research on how to prepare those products, because some of the plants, if they're not processed properly, can be toxic. So this is our native elderberry. Most of the parts of this plant are toxic, and even the unripe berries can give people problems. So just make sure that you're aware of what you're harvesting and how to prepare it properly. A good resource for that is it's one of Lee Peterson's field guides. It's the field guide to edible wild plants. He goes into great detail on how to harvest and prepare a lot of the native edibles in this region. Okay, this is from the this slide is from the Plantscapes website, and a great way to enjoy your native landscape and engage with it is to participate in a lot of the citizen science programs that are out there. Scientists quite a while ago realized that if they could enlist enthusiastic amateurs to make observations and collect data, they could develop a huge treasure trove of data, and at a very low cost. So a number of these programs have been developed now, and this page lists some that are active at the moment, and some of these are ones that I follow. Two of my favorites are at the top. I already mentioned iNaturalist, and there's one called Homegrown National Park, which I'll speak a little more about in a bit. But there's a bunch of other ones as well, and they cover almost any imaginable outdoor interest, from tracking bloom times of flowers to a number of sites for birds, different types of birds. There's one for frogs, monarchs, and other butterflies. A very important bumblebee watch, tracking the population sizes of the different species of bumblebees throughout this region, which is providing very valuable data. Fireflies, dragonflies, ladybugs, and other insects and spiders. So these sites cover the whole gamut, and the good thing about these projects is they draw you in. You can learn a lot about these different organisms and what we need to do to protect them. So my favorite citizen science project right now is Homegrown National Park. This is an effort from Doug Tallamy's lab, and the idea behind this is that on the East Coast, east of the Mississippi River, if we consider the land that's held in private property, it dwarfs even the size of all of our other national parks combined. So if you imagine if we turned some of that private property, whether it's our homes or businesses, if we turn some of those properties or most of those properties into ecological habitats or more ecological habitats, what the power of that could be for enhancing biodiversity. And what Doug Tallamy has done is created a program that maps out the whole United States and people who are interested in native landscapes can log into this site and contribute the plants that they've observed or introduced into their landscapes, so that within Connecticut, for example, you can get an idea of the percentage of private property that's in native plantings now, and how that increases over time. And also, you can zoom into the neighborhood level, so you can see your own property and those of the neighbors around you, so that you get an idea of what other people have planted, and you can either use that as a way to start up conversations with your neighbors. You can also look at how to design the environment in your neighborhood to, for example, include the most number of keystone species or host plant species to create a very diverse environment. So I think this is probably one of the most important citizen science efforts out there. It's only a few months old, so there aren't that many contributors at this point, but it's growing very rapidly, and I think it will be a very interesting and valuable resource in the future. So I encourage you to visit this site and log on if you're interested. One of the other ways of engaging with native landscapes is to take advantage of all of the various botanical gardens that are out there. Many in this region, but there are some very valuable ones in other locations around the country as well. And what these sites offer is some very valuable and rich information on their websites, but many of these places also provide very interesting courses and trips and guided tours that you can take advantage of either in person or online. And they're often free or for only a very nominal cost. So it's a great way to learn more about native landscapes and also support these botanic gardens that are having an important role in educating about native landscapes. One that I'll mention in particular is Audubon. If you have a chance to visit the Boston Nature Center, it's an effort by the Massachusetts Audubon Society, and it's a great example of how quickly a restoration can take place. So about 20 years ago, the Audubon Society acquired a state hospital site in the middle of Boston. It was a very derelict and dangerous location, but they took it on as a project, and over the last 20 years, they've converted it into a beautiful natural landscape with a nature education center and public gardens as well. So if you have a chance, it's a great example of, if we put our minds to this sort of restoration work, how quickly things can change and change for the better. It's really amazing the amount of progress they made in the span of just 20 years. Throughout these talks, I've mentioned a number of different books, and this is my suggested reading list. I've mentioned many of these already. A couple that I'll talk about here are Doug Tallamy's books. Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope are really the most current references, I think, on how to go about planting a native landscape. And they're very inspiring works, and it's all science-based. So he's a wonderful ecologist and naturalist and educator. So his books are all of them are a wonderful read. Another one I haven't talked about, but which is very important, I think, is Sarah Stein's Noah's Garden. So Sarah Stein was really, I would say, the person that kicked off the modern ecological garden movement. She started developing her own property with native plantings in the 1990s, and then started writing about it. And her books are very inspiring, very practical, and very enjoyable reads. So I'd encourage you to take a look at all of her books, but a great one to start with is Noah's Garden. And another way to enhance your knowledge of native landscapes is to visit ones that have been developed in the local area. One great local resource is the Native Plant Collection at Connecticut College. I've linked to their website, and they have a lot of tools online, including an interactive map. So they mapped out where the various species of wildflowers and shrubs and trees are located in their native plant collection. So if you're interested in seeing something, especially how it looks during different times during the year, that's a great way to locate a particular plant and see how they've used it in their collection. And this time of the year is a great time to go to the native plant collection there, because the spring ephemerals are in their glory right now, and they have a wonderful collection of the ephemerals. So it really gives you a good idea of what's possible with that type of plant. Also, that on Sunday mornings, before the pandemic hit, they were doing guided tours of their native plant collection. A local naturalist would take people out for an hour or two for a guided tour of the plant collections, and those are always very interesting. If you're willing and able to drive for a couple hours, there are some really wonderful places within that range that have some great native plant collections. I've talked about Garden in the Woods several times. It's the home of the Native Plant Trust, and it's probably the premier native plant collection in New England. Another great resource is the Arnold Arboretum in Boston. They've really been making an effort in recent years to focus on their native plants, but also developing native plant landscapes in the Arboretum. And it's just a fantastic, beautiful place in the heart of Boston. It's a Frederick Law Olmsted designed park. So you can just meander through its paths and roadways all day long. The nice thing about all of these sites are that they're very well curated and annotated. So there's signs next to a lot of the plants in the landscape, so you can learn a great deal as you're going through the landscape. And finally here, the Berkshire Botanical Garden. has also been adding a lot of native plants to their landscapes. They have a beautiful 5-acre meadow that they've just recently developed. So it gives us a lot of ideas about what the potential is for meadow development. And they also have a wonderful education program there. Being located in the Berkshires, the Appalachian Trail goes right through the middle of that area. And as part of their education offerings, they have very knowledgeable naturalists that will take you out for a guided tour of a natural forest setting or a natural meadow or different types of ecosystems. And it's just a wonderful learning opportunity. And they also have a lot of other in-person and online classes as well. Okay, and finally, when I'm doing Plantscapes designs, one thing I always try to do is provide an area for seating in the landscape, someplace to put a table and chairs or a park bench in an interesting location where there'll be a lot of activity going on. And I encourage people to find a spot like that and visit it often during the day and throughout the season, because natural landscapes are very dynamic. If you go out at different times of the day, you're going to see very different things going on. And likewise throughout the year. One of the wonderful things about native landscapes is how interesting they are throughout the 4 seasons. There's always, once you're keyed into looking for the changes that are going on and the organisms that are interacting, even during the winter time, there's always things to look out for. Also, many of us are looking for opportunities to unplug, to put our screens away for a while. And going out in a native landscape is a great way to do that and kind of recharge our batteries and get reconnected with the natural world. And finally, I encourage people to share their landscapes with their family and friends and neighbors. As we create our own native landscapes, they're all different in a way. So taking advantage of seeing what other people are doing and inviting them in to our landscape is a great way to get new ideas and to share things that we've been learning. And also, if you can invite children into a native landscape, it's a great opportunity for them as well. A lot of children today have a very impoverished experience with nature, again, because of the focus of a lot of our activities on screen-based things. So if we can get young people outside and interacting in the natural environment, that will hopefully engage them and give them an appreciation for the natural world. Okay, so that is all I've got for slides tonight. Thank you all for attending, and I encourage you again to visit the Plantscapes website. If you have any feedback or desire any further information that goes beyond the Q&A, there's a feedback link, and I'll be happy to answer any questions after tonight's program. And with that, Eric, I think I'm ready to go for Q&A if there's any questions out there.